when people get started and, you measure your HRV and things look good, and the natural, follow-up is that they tend to maybe go hard every time because the HRV is always good or things like that, which is the exact opposite of what you should be doing.
That Triathlon Show 144. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Marco Altini, who is the founder of HRV for Training, which is an app that is, in my opinion, simply brilliant for those of you interested in measuring heart rate variability, or HRV, to help guide your training and your recovery. But first, this episode is sponsored by Precision Hydration, and as you know, Precision Hydration is running a special promo in the month of August, so you can get 20% off any electrolyte products that you buy from there using the promo code TTS20, and that's on precisionhydration.com. Be sure to take their free online sweat test first, because then you can get a personalized hydration strategy telling you exactly what sort of electrolyte concentration you need to match your individual sweat rate and sweat sodium content. And also big thanks to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka is the premier brand in the world when it comes to triathlon apparel like wetsuits, swim skins, tri-suits, buoyancy shorts, etc. You can find all of these products on roka.com, and soon they will also have UK distribution, by the way, but for now on roka.com you can buy internationally with no problems whatsoever, and actually you have the great benefit of getting a 20% discount on your entire order when you use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. Alright, so a few more words about my guest Marco Altini. He is a data scientist and developer, mainly working in the fields of sports and health technology. So in addition actually to having HRV for Training, he is also working for a startup called Bloom Life that focuses on helping expecting mothers have a healthy pregnancy. And as an athlete, he is a very passionate runner himself, so he has a ton of knowledge in the endurance sports world, exercise physiology, and so on. He got his PhD in applied machine learning from Eindhoven University, and he is from Italy originally, but living in the Netherlands. He has published 40-plus papers and has a lot of patents in this field of health and sports technology in the past 5 years. So he is really a super knowledgeable guy, and I really enjoyed talking with him. One more thing before jumping into this interview, actually two more things. We have one previous episode on HRV, and if you're not at all familiar with what HRV, heart rate variability, is and how it works, then I recommend actually going back and listening to that episode first. That was episode 42 with Dan Plews, so I'll link to that in the episode description and in the show notes. That's where we go into, from the ground up, what HRV really is. And here with Marco, we go into some more applications, and we don't repeat a lot of things that were already said in that previous episode. So definitely, if you feel that you need to brush up your knowledge of HRV before diving into some stuff that is not from the ground up, not the 101 in HRV, then go and listen to episode 42 before that. And one more thing, my audio quality in this interview is not the best. It sounds like I forgot to plug my external microphone. So actually my sound goes right through the laptop built-in microphone, which is obviously not the best thing to do. But it sounds listenable. I think it will be okay. So hopefully you can bear with me for the lack of audio quality in this interview. All right, let's jump right into the interview with Marco Altini from HRV for Training. Today's guest on That Triathlon Show is Marco Altini from HRV for Training. Hi, Marco. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. I've been following HRV for Training first by downloading the app, but then starting to read the content that you have on your website for quite some time. And we also interviewed Dan Plews a year or so ago and gave basically the listeners an introduction to HRV. So that's episode 42 for those listeners that don't know what this is about. I highly recommend listening to that. And he also is working with you and has used HRV for training a lot. So I'm excited to talk to you and get into some topics that we have planned for today. And let's just start with, what are the main practical applications of HRV and HRV for training in particular?
So I would say that as HRV reflects physiological stress on the body, you can use it in different ways. Stress is a result of pretty much any factor that is part of our lives. And so the ability of assessing, to assess stress objectively can help us making smaller or even larger adjustments towards improved performance in the context of athletes. But in general, I would say even just trying to get to a more balanced lifestyle. The reason why, HRV is used so much in the context of training, typically, in my opinion, is pretty simple, which is that the stressor training can be easily quantified. It's one of the larger stressors that we face, especially for athletes, but I would say even for recreational athletes, training is one of the major stressors that you can apply on the body. And therefore, it's easier to see this feedback loop between training, recovery, measuring HRV as a way to quantify recovery, and then use that information during planning or to adjust trainings, which is a bit more obvious than for applications other than training, where still HRV is able to reflect physiological stress on the body, which again is relevant to pretty much anything we do because it all affects the autonomic nervous system.
And how do we do this adjustment of training or training planning in general with HRV as one of the inputs in practice? Like maybe it's easiest to illustrate with an example. You can do that if you like, but trying to get really practical here.
Yeah, well, so what I say is always the first thing is to have a good training plan. Like HRV is no replacement for your training plan. I think that's important. It's often a bit of a misconception when people get started and, you measure your HRV and things look good, and the natural, follow-up is that they tend to maybe go hard every time because the HRV is always good or things like that, which is the exact opposite of what you should be doing. So in my opinion, I would say our opinion, it's best to, have a good training plan, possibly polarized training plan, do a lot of low intensity training, and then use HRV to make that training plan even more individualized to yourself, because obviously we all respond differently. Even if you work with a coach and your training plan is tailored to your abilities and even your lifestyle and the other things you have to do, still, if you do not measure HRV, you lack this objective feedback of how you are responding to a specific workout, a specific training phase. Then you can use this information in different ways. For example, you can look at day-to-day variations, acute changes. There is research showing, for example, that high-intensity workouts should be planned when HRV is, let's say, trending well, or certainly not when HRV is particularly low with respect to your normal values. So that's a simple, actionable insight. When you get to see your data, then if you add an intense workout and data doesn't look good, you can just postpone that one day or make these small adjustments. And I would say that that's an easy way to start using it, looking at this day-to-day variability.
So to sum up a little bit here, you should have a training plan, or if you work with a coach, you get your individual training plan. And let's say that your HRV is good in a good positive range every single day. Then you don't do any changes. Then you just follow the plan. But if you have on one particular day, for example, a low HRV that is below a certain threshold, then you might need to adjust if you have a hard workout scheduled for that day and not do that workout. Are those some of the main takeaways from what you just described?
Yeah, I would say so. Other ways, you can, as you had done before here, he uses a lot, for example, the baseline, looking at, how you are not, so let's say not specifically at a day-to-day basis, but how more in general you are adapting to a specific training block, say a week or a cycle of 2 or 3 weeks. He looks for adaptations in there, positive adaptations, which are typically reflected as increases in baseline HRV during that period. And if he doesn't see that, you would implement some changes or question why that was not the case and what has changed in the particular sessions that you have scheduled with your athlete. So making changes also at that level. I think a lot of this depends also on the athletes you work with. For example, for elite athletes, training like 1-2 hours per day is the bare minimum, right? And their HRV is also much higher normally, the baseline HRV. So there is more room for variability. And for these athletes, I think what Dan has seen and documented a lot also in his work is that typically the more useful piece of information is this baseline change. While I think that for recreational athletes or people that train much less, have even maybe days off in their week, the training stimulus is already a big stressor, is already much bigger than their normal baseline stress, and therefore day-to-day values can also be used a bit more closely, let's say, for feedback. This is something I see, for example, in my data as an average runner. I see that big sessions have quite significant impact on the following day's HRV, and you can always use baseline changes as they're certainly the most meaningful changes because they simply remove a little of the noise, right? You look at things a bit from a higher level. But then if you look at day-to-day variation, is a bit more actionable, especially for people getting started. And I think you can find a lot of use in that, especially for the non-elite athletes.
That's good. That was actually my next question would have been your take on using the day-to-day HRV versus the baseline. And to clarify, baseline here, it's the 7-day rolling average of HRV that we are usually looking at when we talk about baseline. Is that correct?
Exactly. That's how we compute it. Normally, a week moving average is quite representative of the underlying physiological stress and how you would be adapting to your training cycle and a bit higher level.
Yeah, and that's all available also in HRV for training. You can look at your baseline. I'm looking at my HRV for training app right now, so it's not something that you have to create your own spreadsheets for or anything like that. But I want to talk a little bit more about that baseline because I've personally never seen, even in blocks of training, when I feel that I responded very well, my performance has been improving. I've never seen my baseline go up in my HRV. What do you think? Why is that?
I think in general, when we look at physiology, we need to take a bit of a different approach with respect to the one that is, the basic approach would be higher is better, right? In many of these parameters related to estimating performance or measuring recovering, all of that. But especially with heart rate variability and in general, when working with physiology, I think that the way we should think is that normal is good. So, when things are normal, even they're not outside of what is your normal, then it means that everything is going well, because abnormal physiological levels or values are what you should be concerned about. And as abnormal, we consider both particularly unexpected high peaks or something that happens a bit more often are maybe lower values due to increased load. So those values and reductions in baselines and things like that typically should trigger some sort of change in the plan. If you do not see the increase that Dan was talking about, but things are within your normal values, I would say that's also a sign that things are going well.
Yeah, that's what I've seen in those situations. I certainly see decreases if I've done too much. So that way it definitely works. But I wanted to bring that up to illustrate that it's still not completely black and white, and what Dan has seen in his data doesn't necessarily apply to everybody. It doesn't seem to apply to me personally, for example, even though my training load is probably closer to that of an elite athlete compared to your average triathlete, just in terms of the volume and intensity that I put in.
Yeah. I think that's why it's important to collect your own data for a while. Don't implement changes right away, and see how your physiology responds to a couple of your normal training cycles, a couple of hard sessions. See, also coming back to the day-to-day or moving average, see how your body responds to these sessions, and if the day-to-day changes for you are particularly representative of the effort, or if baseline variations are more what you should look at. So collecting some data and starting looking at this individual variability then can help making the most out of the data.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good summary. And in the day-to-day, if we go back to that a little bit, in the HRV for training app in particular, in HRV research in general, you use usually a unit called RMSSD to measure HRV, but you've simplified that, which I like, to something called recovery points, which is just a number that, at least for me, it usually seems to be in the 9 to 9.5 range, but it can go even, it's not a 0 to 10 scale, if I understand correctly. It can go above that. But can you explain recovery points? Because it's not quite clear to me how they work, and also explain what is a good score and a bad score.
So basically, exactly as you said, the recovery points was a way to make things a little simpler to understand, a little more user-friendly, because, RMSSD is a value which reflects the B2B variability, which is typically something between a few milliseconds and about 200 milliseconds in the general population, and especially, I would say, elite athletes get to those high values. But the regular people, maybe sedentary individuals, get as average in the 20-30 milliseconds range, which is let's say on the low end of our user base, of course, as most people interested in this are doing sports. Now, that being said, the recovery points derive entirely from RMSSD, meaning that the trends and the day-to-day changes, everything will be the exact same as if you were looking at RMSSD, but it's just on a different scale. So we basically is just taking the logarithm of the number, which is because RMSSD is not even normally distributed, which means that normally we do this transformation anyway. So even in research, if you look at the papers, often they report the logarithm of RMSSD. We do that, and then we multiply it by 2, just because humans like numbers between 0 and 10, even though, as you pointed out, that's not exactly the range this ends up being, but pretty close. I would say more in the 5 to 11 range. It's more or less what you get. But as an individual, when you measure the first few times, you will see you have a value which is your baseline, and you will not deviate that much from that value, because your baseline, much of it depends on genetics, for example. So while with some dramatic lifestyle changes, for example, if you have a very unhealthy lifestyle and you start getting things in the right place and doing some exercise and sleeping better and having a better diet, you can certainly make some changes in your baseline, but normally much of it is genetics. So the variations you will see on a day-to-day basis, which will reflect stress and recovery, will be around what's your baseline when you start measuring, most likely.
Okay, that's interesting. So there's no point for somebody who is around, let's say, usually 7 in recovery points to try to strive for getting closer to 10 necessarily. It's just about using that baseline knowledge and working with that, assuming they have a fairly healthy lifestyle, and then
you can
from there.
I'd say you can aim for some small changes. For sure, there can be some improvements, but for example, the improvement you mentioned, for example, that I would say it's borderline impossible. It's just that high variability. I think you just cannot get there with lifestyle changes, but you can always try for little improvements. What I normally say to explain this difference, for example, in the context of heart rate, it's quite clear that a lower heart rate reflects higher fitness level. And, especially if you take someone who is not training much and you go through some decent training program, you will see almost certainly a reduction in resting heart rate, but you will not necessarily see an increase in HRV. I think HRV is better used as this continuous feedback loop that helps you, assessing recovering and making adjustments more than as an overall marker of fitness. There is a relation, of course, also with fitness, but it's very weak. So I would use it differently.
But you did say that elite athletes generally have higher. So
Correct,
can you clarify that?
I would say in general, but that does not mean that there is a strong relationship. For example, you can have fantastic athletes which have lower baselines, and you can have people with higher baselines and no particular, athletic talent. So for certain parameters, that's impossible, right? So for example, if you measure, I don't know, VO2 max and you take, sedentary individuals, they will have a low value, right? And then if you take elite athletes, they will have a high value. There is like no confusion in there. While if you take array variability, you could get some people mixed up. So it's not that of a strong relationship between the two, even though typically elite athletes tend to have a higher value.
Okay, got it. So one question that it's actually one of my most important questions for today, because this is something that I've personally been wondering about, is there a potential of you, for example, having a lower than baseline HRV one day, and you had a hard training session scheduled, and you decide to not do it? Is there a potential that you may be holding yourself back unnecessarily if you follow HRV to make these changes?
So I'll answer first with a study that was published recently, which is very interesting, where they put runners through a training program before a 10K, and then they had just one group basically skipping these hard sessions when their HRV baseline was below, I think either below their normal values or simply trending negatively. So they would just not even do that session another day. It would just be one less intense session. And eventually this group performed better than the control group that trained, doing the typical workouts they would have done, also eventually more high intensity sessions, which, says that in general, the fact that the other group rested when they were simply not physiologically ready to take possibly that kind of load made them perform better in the long term. So that was interesting.
Very interesting. Yes.
In general, it's hardly the case, I would say. So, people tend just to go too hard too often. Even just doing a good switch towards a polarized training is typically hard, especially for recreational athletes. Spending that much time at low intensities. I think HRV can be a way to get a little more aware about your body's response and in general about the intensities that you should be keeping. Holding back a bit too often, I think it's not really the main problem, especially because, these low values being lower than your normal, statistically speaking, it's not something that can happen too often, right? Because you take a margin which by definition is unlikely to be where your daily score is. So I wouldn't say that that's been something of a concern.
Unless you start to gradually get your baseline down as well. But that's, I guess, why you should also monitor that to make sure that you don't have those long-term changes. In that case, maybe assess if you need to make changes to your program.
Yeah, true. There is always a trade-off, between also how big is this window of normal values, and because if you take a very long window, you might be able to understand better when baseline changes are outside of your normal due to some major stressors months over months. But if you take it that long, then you might also miss some physiological adaptations and get stuck into what you were considering your normal a long time ago. So there are some trade-offs there, and eventually what we decided was a good way to do this was to use the past 60 days. So that's what the app does. We use the past 2 months to understand what's your normal physiological variability, and then in that way, on a day-to-day basis, we look where's your score with respect to the past 2 months variability, and to determine if stress is significantly higher or not, and then provide advice that way. And I think that's a decent trade-off, because you can keep into account acute changes on a very short term, but also things happening over a couple of weeks, which can be the case if there are some other major stressors, which are not just intense workouts, but anything happening, work, family, traveling, all sorts of things that can have a long-lasting effect on your physiology, or getting sick, all sorts of things.
Yeah. And you mentioned there that study that they skipped the workout completely. Are there any guidelines that we can give as for whether to replace a hard workout with just an easy workout, or skip a workout completely?
Yeah, I think what they skipped was the hard session, but probably they kept a low intensity one. In general, my understanding is that you would just reduce the intensity. So depending on what's the athlete history, you can have just a easier session, not necessarily rest.
Okay, yeah, that's good and actionable advice. So let's talk a little bit about some additional insights that are available in the HRV for Training app, and some of the most interesting ones, I think at least, are the ones that are specifically HRV related. So the acute changes and the HRV trends. Can you tell us a little bit more about these, and maybe if there are other insights that you consider the most useful for athletes, and how specifically the listeners can benefit from those?
So the HRV trends, I think indeed is one of the more interesting insights, because in there we take an approach in which we do not look only at your HRV score, but we look at how heart rate has been changing in the past 2 weeks, again with respect to what's your history, your past 2 months, your normal variability. We look at heart rate, we look at heart rate variability, we look at the coefficient of variation of heart rate variability. So basically, how much day-to-day jumping you have. If you have a certain baseline, you could have pretty much that same value every day, or you could have your data going up and down and averaging at that same value, right? So the coefficient of variation tells us something about this difference. And what has been shown typically is that you have a bit less jumping around when you respond well to a certain training block. So that information, together with heart rate variability, as well as, of course, context, for example, simply how much you're training with respect to the previous weeks, is something that we use to try to determine what's your basically how well you're coping to the current training block, if things are going well, or if there is some risk for accumulating fatigue or maladaptation to training. So I think that's one of the more interesting insights, because you do not rely only on a single parameter, but you try to look a bit at more things. Then there's other insights, more specific maybe for runners or cyclists, for example, to estimate VO2 max or lactate thresholds, without requiring specific tests, but just from workouts, as you have now in some other platforms or sport watches. That's something we've done as part of my research during my PhD, and then later also with HRV for Training, using data to try to determine what parameters are more representative of these, let's say, predictors of performance, so that people can track how things are going as they train, and use that also as feedback. other things, again, around polarized training and training intensity distribution, training load. There is, standard chronic and acute training load models. With the web platform that we just launched, I think we tried to do some work on top of what is the typical output you have, so that it's a bit easier to understand what's freshness or injury risk in a certain week, given what you've been doing in the recent past. Trying to get those things a bit more actionable with respect to what you have in other places.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a good summary, and I think we'll link to some articles on your website so people can get an overview and some screenshots and images that show these things as well, because you have some good articles that showcase these things there on hrvfortraining.com. So that will all be linked to in the show notes. And one thing that I want to clarify with the HRV trends is that if it wasn't clear, that you actually have the user doesn't have to themselves go and make all sorts of interpretations from raw numbers, but you actually give some specific advice, like a detected trend, I think it's called, and
exactly.
And tell the user basically that you're trending positively, or you seem to be responding well to training, and vice versa if the numbers show the opposite.
Exactly.
Okay, so one other question that I had is a good workflow for athletes and coaches that work together, and how they can use HRV in the training. What's your take on that?
So I think in general, the way I would start with this, again, is just to start measuring, collecting some data, trying to understand how an athlete responds to certain specific sessions, as well as longer term training cycles. And then based on the plan you have, the individual plan you've built with your coach, and the response of the athlete to certain sessions, start to seeing if you can make certain changes, start to see if these variations in physiology and the results you get in terms of recovery make sense for what you see also in terms of adaptation and performance. If you see indeed that things are not trending particularly well when the athlete maybe failed to reach the state that you thought was gonna be reached given the training stimulus. All of that, I would say, can be a way to start using this information and include it in the training plan, so that you can eventually truly individualize the plan to a person's specific response to the stimulus. Eventually what you want is always to apply a certain stimulus stressor training, and then have an adaptation and improve eventually performance and reach the goal you set for that person. And having this objective feedback of recovery and of physiological stress can help you, keeping that feedback loop close and tuning things in an optimal way.
Yeah, and one very useful feature that you have is that the user can sync HRV for training with training peaks, so that the HRV values become visible for the coach, so they can follow. And you also have a pro version of the app for coaches. So can you take a few quick sentences to describe that?
Yeah, so we launched just last month actually this web platform. So as a coach, you can have you can add your athletes and have your athletes' data in there, see some of these visualizations also in a bit of a better and nicer way, I would say, just because, there is more space on a computer. We built in there several things that try again to abstract a little more this day-to-day variability and get you to understand, the big picture and see how physiology is trending in general with respect to training. All this story about the 2 months normal data and how your baseline is going, that's pretty clear in the web platform. You have a nice range of values and you see where your athlete is at a certain time, so it's easier than to make adjustments and to act on this data.
Perfect. And you mentioned one interesting study there, a recent study. What else is going on in HRV research at the moment? Are there any interesting recent findings or trends that we should be aware of?
So let's say that now it's easier to measure thanks to the technology that has been developed in the past few years. So there's a lot of research going on, I would say, both on elite athletes and in recreational ones, things that, aim at taking things from the lab to real life, larger populations, see how the different parameters interact with each other so that you can understand better, physiological responses to training in the case of athletes and how to optimize things in the long term. One aspect that I like, that is the research that is Sean Williams is doing. He looks at training load and HRV a bit differently from others, meaning that, all these models for training load analysis and freshness and injury risk that we also have, they typically are based on training impulse. So, the basic unit of information is in Training Peaks would be TSS. So your workout summary in terms of intensity and volume. And that information does not necessarily link to how your body has responded to that session. So all these models do not really take into account the physiology of the athlete. So what Sean is doing is to look at training load and HRV at the same time, both in these standard models, but also, looking at how these parameters change with respect to injury risk. So one of the insights that he had in his last paper was that a negative trend in HRV or a high acute to chronic training load, which is also a sign, one of the red flags for injury risk, taken by themselves were not predictive of actual injury. But when you had them together, then you had a much higher likelihood that the athlete would eventually get injured. So, combining the acute to chronic training load, so basically how much load you put recently with respect to what you're normally used to take, together with your own physiological response to that training load, was predictive of injury more than any other parameter taken isolated or positive trends. So I think that's good information, something that could also be possibly extrapolated to other sports or different conditions, something to investigate. This was a small study and was also in CrossFit athletes. So this is different from, the endurance world. But I think, the findings make a lot of sense, right? So you look at acute and chronic load and you look at how your body has responded, and a negative combination of these two parameters is not a good thing. So, looking forward to seeing more of this kind of work.
Yeah, that is extremely fascinating, and it intuitively makes a lot of sense that the two together would be much more beneficial than training stress score alone. I think it's a good tool to use, but I also have my criticism of training stress score, and definitely encourage any athlete not to take it as gospel, because if you just look at an example like let's say you're doing 30-second run intervals, like you do 10 of them and with quite long recovery, but you do them all out. The training stress score in Training Peaks, or when you calculate it with the standard model based on the Bannister model, it's very low for something like that, just because the duration is so low of those sprints, the high intensity. But the reaction of your body can be very, very different, and especially for athletes that are more aerobic slow twitch, that can be quite a significant impact. And that's something that maybe with HRV together with the training stress score you would be able to see, and training stress score itself would not be able to detect something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's key, especially in these things, to try to put together all the different pieces, and then gain some real insights instead of blindly following just one or the other.
Yeah. So what does the future hold for HRV in general, do you think, and for HRV for training in particular?
So I think, in the past, I would say 5 years, there's been a huge amount of work in making these things more user friendly and practical. We have our camera based measurement. Others have other sensors that are not just straps, which are still very convenient to use in the morning. It's now easy to use, and there is many more people doing it, which I think is great because it's bringing more awareness. There is, courses that Jason has put together at Elite HRV. So the course is HRV course, I think. Something that I would also recommend checking out. It's
HRVcourse.com.
Yeah, exactly. There is more information, there is more awareness that it makes sense to measure your physiology and how your body is responding to the different stressors. I think what's next is to make it a bit easier also to interpret this data. It can be still a bit overwhelming and confusing. So, step by step, trying to get there. In our work with HRV for training, I think the next steps are towards planning a little more, so providing or helping, advanced athletes and coaches, providing an infrastructure where they can build things and training plans and follow their athletes and easily adjust things based on actual physiological responses. That's, I think, where we are going to try to go in the next year.
That's exciting, and I have to give you a lot of credit for what you've done already with HRV for training. I think it's a brilliant app, and the thing that you mentioned about interpreting the raw data, from when I first downloaded HRV for training and started using it, it's come a long way in terms of giving you that feedback and explaining what your measurements actually mean and how you can potentially interpret them to make it more user friendly and actionable. So kudos for that. That's great.
That's nice to hear.
For people who want to learn more, this episode has been quite technical, although we try to distill it to the main takeaways and the important practical points. But you have a lot of good resources on your website that can help explain these things further. What would be your top picks in terms of articles or other resources that you have for the interested listener to go and check out?
So I would go with one on the physiological underpinning of HRV. I'd say, you don't need to get a PhD on the topic, but I think it's important here to understand that there is no magic or fad, right? It's, measuring parasympathetic activity. The processes, physiologically speaking, are very clear. So I have a couple of resources where we try to cover this in a way that is more or less understandable. And then, you can get a little more confidence about what you're doing and what you're measuring if you understand a little more about what is actually being measured and how that relates to training or other forms of stress. So I start there. Another one, which is key, we talked a lot here about measuring HRV and taking for granted a lot, in particular around best practices. Physiology changes continuously throughout the day due to all sorts of acute stressors, from, having coffee to light physical activity, moving around, reading things online and getting upset. All sorts of factors will have an impact on your physiology. So it makes really no sense to measure your HRV throughout the day, for example, because you will just have, a reflection of those stressors. What you want to measure is your underlying chronic physiological stress. That's why the app should be used first thing in the morning. There are a couple of other things, trying to stay consistent in terms of body position and daily routine when you measure morning routine at least. So those kind of things, I think, are also important to highlight for someone that gets started with these things and tries to collect data that will actually, make sense and lead to useful insights. I think those are two good ones. Maybe one on what to do when you get some of the data, and again, linking back to using it to adjust your training plan, not as a replacement of it, and starting with small changes and looking at day-to-day variability as well as baseline changes and adaptation to specific training blocks.
Okay, so I'll ask you to email those links to me afterwards, and we can link them up in the show notes. And any other thing that come to mind that we've discussed, like the links to some of the papers that you mentioned with the runners and with the the modeling and predicting injuries and those sorts of things. So we can get it all into the show notes. And I'll also add episode 42, the interview that I did with Dan Plews, that also goes into a bit more of the basics of HRV and the physiology behind it, since that was the first HRV episode that I did on this podcast. So that'll also be in the show notes. So
Perfect.
Let's move into the rapid fire questions. And these ones are very short and fast. So take absolutely no more than 15 seconds to answer these. Starting with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports or to your field of expertise in general?
I would say for endurance sports or running in particular, the science of running is something I tend to get back to. Like once in a while, there is a lot of very good content there. The author is Magnus. If you are self-coached athlete or even coaches, it's a great resource. Bit technical, but that's the point.
Yeah, Steve Magnus, will link to that, and I agree, it's a really good one. What's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Planning, definitely. Being well organized, consistency, not procrastinating ever. That's it.
And what do you wish you had known or wish you had done differently at some point in your career?
I don't know. Related to sports, maybe, as much as now I try to preach listening to your body, I haven't done that much at the beginning. The whole polarized training and HRV came to me a bit late, which brought significant improvements, but, it would have been, I think, valuable to start much earlier.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Marco. We'll link to your website, your personal and HRV's website and all the social media. But it's all at hrvfortraining.com and HRV for Training on Facebook and Instagram, I think. So
exactly. Yeah. Easy to find.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I really hope that you enjoyed that interview. I found it one of the most fascinating discussions that I've had in a long, long time, actually. I'm really, really eager to dive into my HRV data even more now that I talked with Marco. I am a user of HRV for Training. I use it every single morning. And that is actually my first main takeaway from this interview. If you gather data consistently and in a consistent manner, like do it first thing in the morning in the same position, whether it's lying down or sitting up, then that's when you get to really know yourself, your individual baseline, your normal values. And that's how you can get a feel for what effect various things like hard training sessions, lack of sleep, etc. may have on your HRV. So the more you do this, the more consistently you do this, the more you'll start to benefit from HRV. It's like the compound effect in this way. You get more and more benefit from it the more you do it in a good and consistent manner. The second important takeaway is that you need to have a good training plan. HRV is not a replacement for that by any means. If you have that training plan and you measure HRV and everything is in the green in terms of HRV, then just keep following the plan. It's not licensed to go out and add additional hard workouts to your plan. You should just follow the plan as is. However, if HRV is in the red below your normal values, then that's when you can use it to adjust your training to get more benefit from it. That's an example of a day when you might replace that hard session with an easy one and maybe come back to the hard session the next day. And I had a personal example of this when I'm in Finland right now. And when I was traveling from Lisbon to where my family lives in Finland, it's a long, hard travel. I fly to Stockholm and then I take, this time actually since I brought my bike, I had to take a taxi for 1 hour or so. It wasn't expensive. It's my most expensive taxi ride. Probably I paid more for this one taxi ride than I paid for taxis in my entire 28-year-long life up until this point, I think. Anyway, I took the taxi to the harbor to get my bike there, and then the ferry to get to the island off the coast of Finland, which is actually more off the coast of Sweden now that I think of it, geographically speaking, but it belongs to Finland. So that's my travel. It takes the entire day. It's faster to get to Rio de Janeiro from Lisbon than it is to get to where my family lives. And the next morning, my HRV was very much in the red. I was exhausted. So I did not do the hard run that I had scheduled, and I pushed it forward to the next day when I had a brilliant run instead. The day after the travel, I just chose to do an easy run, and a 40-minute easy run rather than an hour and 15 minutes of 20 minutes super hard. 20 times 1 minute super hard, 1 minute easy. So there you have a practical example that's can maybe be illustrative for you. My final takeaway is that when you use an app like HRV for training, it really makes it so much easier to make interpretations of the data as the app actually does it for you. HRV for training does anyway. I'm not really familiar with other apps. And as you heard, I know that there are a lot of systems, apps, softwares that try to do interpretations on all sorts of things. Some of them are good, some of them are very bad and try to over-interpret or analyze things. I think, in my opinion, and again, this comes from an engineering background as well, I think HRV for training does a brilliant job with this. It's not over-interpreting and over-analyzing your data. It gives advice that is solid. It's based on solid evidence and great expertise, but it doesn't try to force you and pigeonhole you into one particular narrow solution for a certain HRV or whatever it might be able to do if it was poorly designed and poorly, I guess, planned in the first place. And that is one of the main reasons that I love HRV for training. It really helps me interpret the data, and that evidence base and the expertise, and also having Marco be a runner himself is one of the main reasons why I think it works so well and why I invited Marco on the show in the first place. So we'll have a lot of articles linked to in the show notes as we talked about, and they will also be linked to in the episode description. You can find the show notes as usual on thattriathlonshow.com or go directly to scientifictriathlon.com/TTS144. If you have questions or comments, leave them at the bottom of that show notes page and I will get back to you there. In the next episode, we have an age group case study with the Swedish superfast age grouper, world-class age grouper, Carl Brummer, who is 49 years old and one of the best in the world in his age group. Among other accomplishments, he has placed 4th in Kona in his age group. He has won the Ironman South Africa this year, and he has placed 3rd in Frankfurt and gone sub-9 several times. And the funny thing is, or the interesting thing is that he does this on a very low training volume. He did 8:52, his best Ironman time ever, on usually 8 hours per week of training last year, if I recall correctly. Something crazy low like that. And we go into how he does that in this next episode, next Monday, in this case study. And also a quick house cleaning item. The giveaway is now finished by the time you listen to this, but it's not finished by the time I record this. So the winners will be announced via email as soon as I draw them, which will have happened or will happen within a day or so of you listening to it if you listen as this episode comes out. But on the podcast, I will probably announce it only in episode 146 because I have also recorded episode 145 in advance. Big thanks to our sponsors, Roka, that you can find on roka.com. I think that one of the best ways to become better in the sport of triathlon is to emulate what the best are doing. And many of the best are really using Roka. We have Mario Mola, Xavier Gomez, we have Glenn Jorgensen and Lucy Charles, and all sorts of other top athletes in triathlon and outside of triathlon, in cycling, in open water swimming, many different endurance sports. So check out Roka and use the promo code That's Triathlon Show, all one word, all caps, to get 20% off your entire order. And big thank you to Precision Hydration that you can find on precisionhydration.com. They have a fantastic blog if you want to learn more in-depth things about hydration and electrolytes, how to use them, how to apply them in certain specific circumstances that may apply to you. There's a ton of great content there, so I highly recommend you visit. It's right under hydration advice on their website, precisionhydration.com. And of course, while you're there, if you find that you need to pick up some more electrolytes, you still have a few days left this week specifically, because this is an August-only promo, to pick up some more electrolytes with the promo code TTS20 for 20% off your entire order. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.